On a warm January afternoon in 1919, the people of Boston's North End were killed by desert. There was no warning, no alarm, just a deep groan from a 50-foot steel tank near the harbor, and then a wave. A wall of molasses, 2.5 stories tall, moving at 35 miles an hour. Faster than you can run. It crushed buildings. It tore a fire station off its foundation, and it drowned 21 people in syrup. And the company that owned the tank had a very simple explanation for all of it. It was, they said, a bomb. This is the story of the slowest, sweetest, stupidest disaster in American history, and the 3 years it took one stubborn man to prove the bomb never existed. Let us start with the murder weapon. In 1915, a company called Purity Distilling needed somewhere to store molasses. Lots of it. Molasses back then was not just for baking. You ferment it, you distill it, and you get industrial alcohol, which during a world war means munitions and money. So they built a tank, an enormous one, 50 feet tall, 90 feet across, holding about 2.25 million gallons. The problem is the word built is doing a lot of heavy lifting here because the man they put in charge of building it had one notable qualification. He could not read a blueprint. His name was Arthur Gell, and Gell was not an engineer. He was a treasurer, an accountant, a man whose entire job was making numbers smaller. So when the engineers told him the proper way to test a giant tank was to fill it with water first, to check for leaks before you trust it with anything dangerous, Gell looked at the cost of all that water and decided to skip it. He filled it with about 6 inches instead. Tested nothing, and then he ordered it filled to the brim with molasses. The tank, for its part, immediately began to tell everyone exactly what it thought of this plan. From the very first day, the tank leaked. Molasses seeped out of the seams so reliably that the neighborhood children would scrape it off the sides with sticks and eat it, which is genuinely the most Boston detail in this entire story. Every time it was filled, the tank groaned and rumbled like something alive. Locals complained. The company's response to a structure that was visibly weeping and audibly moaning was a masterclass in corporate problem solving. They painted it brown. Now the leaks did not show. Problem, as far as the accounting department was concerned, solved. What came out was not a trickle. It was a wave between 15 and 25 feet high, and here is the part that sounds like a lie. Cold molasses is thick and slow, the very definition of slow. But under sudden pressure, it behaves strangely, thinning out as it surges. So this wave did not ooze. It charged 35 miles an hour through a crowded city street. It snapped the steel supports of an elevated train line. It picked up a loaded freight car and threw it. It lifted houses off their foundations. People did not get a chance to run because nobody on earth expects to be outrun by syrup. And this is where the comedy stops, because the way molasses kills is uniquely awful. The wave knocked people flat, swept them along, slammed them into walls and debris. 21 people died. About half of them did not die from the impact. They drowned, pinned and held in a rising tide of syrup too thick to swim through and too heavy to climb out of. Rescuers waded in up to their chests and could barely move. Every time they pulled one person free, the molasses pulled back. It was, by every account, the single most horrible rescue any of them had ever worked. The cleanup was almost as surreal as the flood. The molasses had cooled and set into a sticky, gluey mass over everything. It took crews, using salt water pumped from the harbor, 2 full weeks just to wash the streets. The harbor itself ran brown until the summer. And for years afterward, North End residents swore that on a hot day you could still smell molasses rising up out of the cobblestones and the brick. The neighborhood had been, quite literally, soaked in the stuff. But while Boston scrubbed, the company that owned the tank was already building its defense. And its defense was magnificent. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which by now owned the tank, stood up in front of the public and announced that they were not to blame. The tank had not failed. It had been bombed, sabotaged, they claimed, by anarchists. And in 1919, this was a genuinely clever lie, because America was in the middle of a real anarchist bombing panic. Bombs were going off. So the company pointed at the headlines and said, "See, it was them, not us." It was a beautiful piece of misdirection. Blame the scary thing everyone is already afraid of, and quietly hope nobody checks the rivets. So the families sued. 119 lawsuits bundled together against one of the most powerful chemical companies in the country with the best lawyers money could buy. And to settle it, the court did something unusual. Instead of a jury, it appointed a single official auditor to hear everything and decide the truth. His name was Hugh Ogden. And Ogden was about to spend 3 years of his life listening to thousands of witnesses and sorting through more than 1,500 pieces of evidence, all to answer one deceptively simple question. Was it a bomb, or was it just a cheap tank? The company brought in experts to swear the steel had been blown outward by dynamite. So Ogden listened, and then he looked at the actual metal, and the metal told a different story. The cracks had started at the rivet holes, the weakest points, exactly where a tank under too much pressure fails on its own. There was no scorching, no blast pattern, none of the signatures a bomb leaves behind. The steel had simply been asked to hold more than it ever could. There was no saboteur. The only thing that attacked that tank was molasses, gravity, and arithmetic. And when investigators dug into how the tank had actually been built, it got embarrassing fast. The steel walls were too thin. A modern engineering study found they were roughly half as thick as they should have been, even by 1915 standards. The steel was the wrong kind, brittle, missing the ingredient that keeps metal from cracking in the cold. There were too few rivets. Nobody qualified had ever checked the design, because in 1919, astonishingly, you did not need anyone qualified to check the design. There was no permit, no inspection. No engineer required to sign off on a 50-foot tank of pressurized liquid sitting next to a neighborhood. The accountant had simply built it and hoped. In 1925, after 3 years, Hugh Ogden delivered his ruling. There was no bomb. The company was responsible, fully and entirely, for building a tank that was a disaster waiting to happen and then ignoring 4 years of it warning them. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company paid out around $628,000, somewhere over $11 million in today's money, split among the families that came to roughly $7,000 for each person the molasses had killed. The anarchist story, the bomb, the scary headline misdirection was finished. It had bought the company 3 years. It had never once been true. But here is the part that actually changed the world. For decades, large structures in America had been built more or less on trust. The molasses flood made it impossible to keep pretending that was fine. A treasurer who could not read a blueprint had killed 21 people, and the law had no answer for it. So states began to fix that. They started requiring that engineers be licensed and that building plans be reviewed and stamped, physically signed by a qualified professional who would put their own name and their own reputation on the line. That stamp, the one on every certified building plan in America today, traces in a straight line back to a tank full of syrup near Boston Harbor.